Good evening, the name's Bond, Captain Goodspeed Bond, and welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to be looking back at our Bond star of the 90s, Pierce Brosnan, who was an incredible Bond for me. He was probably the perfect epitome of Bond back in the time. He brought Bond back into the modern era, and we're going to be ranking his films from worst to best. For many fans who grew up in the 1990s, Brosnan was James Bond. He brought style, charm, and a cool confidence that perfectly blended the elegance of classic Bond with the action-heavy blockbuster era. But his journey to becoming 007 is actually one of the most fascinating almost stories in Bond history. Back in the mid-1980s, when Roger Moore stepped down after A View to a Kill, producers Albert R. Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson were looking for a brand new Bond. Their top choice, Pierce Brosnan. At the time, Brosnan was starring in the TV show Remington Steele, and the producers loved his suave, classic Bond look. He was even publicly announced as the new 007. But then, chaos. The network suddenly renewed Remington Steele after the Bond announcement, which meant Brosnan was contractually unable to leave the show. With production on the next Bond film looming, the producers had to move on. Enter Timothy Dalton, who stepped into the role for The Living Daylights and License to Kill. Fast forward to the early 1990s, and after a 6-year hiatus for the franchise following legal trouble, Bond was ready to return. Dalton had departed, and finally, nearly a decade after first being considered, Pierce Brosnan got his chance. His debut would come in 1995 with GoldenEye, a film that not only introduced Brosnan, but revitalised the entire franchise. He would go on to make 4 Bond films between 1995 and 2002, bridging the gap between the Cold War era and the modern blockbuster age. He'd also feature in various video games around the time in what many consider to be the golden age of Bond gaming. But today, I'm ranking those 4 films from worst to best. And remember, when we're talking about Bond, even the worst entry is still pretty entertaining. Number 004. Well, it's probably a surprise that it's not another film that's in the bottom spot.
Filthy habit.
Coming in at number 4 is Tomorrow Never Dies from 1997. This film sees Bond take on media mogul Elliot Carver, played with a scene-stealing villainy by Jonathan Pryce. Carver's plan? Manipulate world events using his global media empire to start a war between Britain and China, all so he could dominate the news market, which honestly feels even more relevant today than it did back in the 90s. The film moves at a relentless pace and features some fantastic action sequences. The standout moment has to be the famous BMW remote control car chase in a parking garage. We also get one of the franchise's most memorable allies in Wei Lin, played by Michelle Yeoh, who is every bit Bond's equal. So why is it at number 4? Well, for me, it's never been one that I've went to. It's never really been one that I choose to watch. It's one that I've found quite boring, actually, on multiple viewings. It's a strange one because it's got a great villain. Brosnan's performance is brilliant. It's got a good cast. It's got good action sequences. It's got a good score. It's got a great story. But for me, I just never thrilled watching it. And it's always been something that I wish I could enjoy more. But, you know, it's still a very entertaining Bond adventure. I just think I prefer the other 3. It's time for 003. You know what? This one very nearly became number 2 on my most recent watching. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Saved by the bell.
Next up at number 3 is Die Another Day, released back in 2000. This was the 20th James Bond film and marked the 40th anniversary of the franchise, so the filmmakers packed it with references and callbacks to earlier Bond movies. The film begins with one of the most dramatic openings in Bond history. Bond captured in North Korea and held prisoner for over a year before finally being released. This is a real highlight of the film, and something that we've not really seen done with Bond up until that point. Bond is vulnerable and Bond is left alone out there in the field. He's almost forgotten about, and that's what makes it quite chilling actually when you think of how easily they could dispose of Bond. From there, the story leads us to villain Gustav Graves, played by Toby Stephens, who's a billionaire with a mysterious past and a dangerously powerful satellite weapon. Now, Die Another Day is definitely the most controversial of Brosnan's films, if not the whole franchise. It's quite commonly seen as being one of the worst in the franchise. However, on more recent viewings for me, it's something that's really, really enjoyable, and I do think the first hour and a half or so of the film is god-tier Bond, in all honesty, from those moments in North Korea to the Cuba sequences to Bond going around London, that incredible sword fight scene, and going into that abandoned tube station that perhaps inspired future Skyfall scenes. It really is a joy to watch. Where it starts going downhill is when we get to Iceland and some of the really bad CGI comes in. It doesn't bother me so much, and actually on my most recent viewing I watched it on Netflix on my phone, and that famous water sequence where he's kite surfing the tsunami, it looks okay on a small device. So I guess when you think about the size of TVs back in 2002, maybe that's how they intended it to look. But there's lots to love as well. I love the invisible car. The Ice Palace is a really cool villain lair, and there's a lot of early 2000s CGI that hasn't aged gracefully, but it is always entertaining to watch. But honestly, I love it, and I think it's incredibly fun. Number 002. Now, this film, certainly in the first 20 minutes to half an hour, just makes you feel so good, so proud to be British. And what a theme song this has got. It's got a brilliant musical soundtrack, and I could only put one film above this.
Stop! It isn't finished! Stop!
So taking second place is The World Is Not Enough from 1999. This film certainly got one of the most interesting plots of the Brosnan era, centred around oil pipelines, in international power struggles, and the kidnapping of oil heiress Electra King, played brilliantly by Sophie Marceau. Bond is tasked with protecting her after the death of her father, but as the story unfolds, we discover that things are far more complicated than they first appear. One of the standout aspects of this film is the villain Renard, played by Robert Carlyle, a terrorist who literally cannot feel pain due to a bullet lodged in his brain. We finally find out that Electra and Renard fell in love with each other when Renard had kidnapped Electra King many years before, and their lust for power is so obvious on screen, and I do really feel like you can see the turn of Electra throughout this film, and I do think that that is particularly powerful. In fact, Electra is one of the only female villains in the franchise, and she is arguably the only main female villain in the franchise, and I think that that is a big plus point for The World Is Not Enough. It's got that millennium feeling, and it really makes you feel proud to be British in that pre-title sequence. But the real reason that this film ranks so highly for me is that Brosnan gives some of his strongest dramatic material. It's possibly his most Fleming-esque performance in this film, and you can really see that he does care for Electra throughout it, and it does hurt him at the end when he has to put a bullet in her and never miss. His Bond feels more emotional, more reflective, and more human than in any other films. It's got great action, great Bond girl in Christmas Jones, and a fantastic score, once again, by David Arnold. For me, The World Is Not Enough is more than enough on a nice Sunday afternoon if you want a bit of Bond. And finally, number 001. So yes, it comes down to this, perhaps the best ever introduction to a brand new Bond. It still holds the test of time, and it's one of the absolute elite level Bond films.
Beg your pardon? Forgot to knock.
And taking top spot is the film that started it all for Brosnan, GoldenEye. Released in 1995 after the 6-year break for the franchise, this movie had enormous pressure on it. Bond needed to prove he was still relevant in the post-Cold War world, and GoldenEye absolutely delivered. The film introduces us to villain Alec Trevelyan, also known as 006, played by Sean Bean, and certainly is Bond's equal throughout the film. In fact, the film has got a great entourage of villains, including General Arumov, Zanya Onatop, and Boris Grushenko, played by Alan Cumming, is an absolute joy to watch on the screen. The film also introduces Natalia, played by Isabella Scorupco, and she is one of the strongest Bond girls that we ever see on screen, although admittedly she is very frustrating to play with on 007 GoldenEye on the N64. However, I'm not going to hold that against her. She was a great Bond girl, and I do really feel that Brosnan, or Brosnan's Bond at least, fell in love with her in this film. As I mentioned before, there's one of the most iconic henchwomen in this film, Zanya Onatop, played by Famke Janssen, who has the quirky feature of asphyxiating her enemies with her thighs. From the bungee jump opening to the tank chase through St. Petersburg, GoldenEye is packed with classic Bond moments that will fill any highlight reel. It perfectly balances humour, action and espionage, and it establishes Brosnan as a fantastic Bond from the very beginning. His performance in particular is incredibly confident and perhaps the best ever first film for a new Bond. For me, it's not just the best of Brosnan's era, it's got to be one of the best Bond films, full stop. Looking back now, Pierce Brosnan's time as Bond represents a really interesting chapter in the franchise. He successfully carried 007 through the 1990s blockbuster era, combining the classic elegance of earlier Bonds with modern action spectacle. His version of Bond was stylish, confident and effortlessly cool, a perfect bridge between the eras of Connery, Moore and the more grounded approach that would later come with Daniel Craig, starting with Casino Royale. Even though his final film divided audiences, Brosnan has remained hugely popular among fans and played a massive role in keeping Bond relevant for a new generation. In fact, in the current hiatus of Bond, many have called for an old Brosnan to play in his well-deserved 5th film, even into his 70s. As I said before, he played in many video games, and I would highly recommend playing through Everything or Nothing, which features Pierce Brosnan's voice for Bond and likeness, and it really does feel like Pierce Brosnan's 5th film of the franchise. He did say yes to another film, but unfortunately the producers decided to go in another direction and went with Daniel Craig for Casino Royale onwards. Without the successes of his films, though, the franchise might not have even reached the heights that it did in the 21st century. So here's to Brosnan. What a fantastic Bond, and let's all be honest, if we're thinking of Bond and who we would want to be, it would probably be Brosnan's.
For England, James? No. For me.
But that's just my ranking. I want to hear about your Bond film ranking for Pierce Brosnan. Let me know down in the comment section how wrong I've got it and how you would rank Brosnan's Bond films from worst to best. Thank you very much for watching. Make sure you subscribe for plenty more Bond-related content, all ranging from games, collectibles, merchandise, trivia, and most importantly, the films. So we are looking forward to 007 First Light in the next few months. But for now, with all of that being said, goodbye, Mr. Bond.